When the young and charming Josh knocked on my door, I thought he was just here to fix my bathroom sink. But what happens when a routine repair turns into something far more unexpected? How does a woman like me at 72 navigate feelings I thought were long gone? And with a man I could never have imagined. Stay tuned as I share the story of how a simple house call changed my life forever. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories like this one, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I never thought my quiet life would take such a turn. It began like any other day, the sun filtering through the lace curtains of my kitchen. I sat at the oak table, sipping lukewarm tea while flipping through a well-thumbed gardening magazine. The house was eerily silent, as it had been since Harold passed nearly a decade ago. His absence still felt like an echo that bounced off the walls, especially during moments like this. The knock on the door startled me, jolting me out of my reverie. I placed the cup down carefully, smoothing the folds of my apron as I made my way to the door. There he stood, a tall, broad-shouldered young man, his tool belt slung low on his hips. His name tag read Josh, and his confident smile revealed a row of perfect teeth. "Mrs. Phelps?" he asked, his voice warm yet professional. "Yes, that's me," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "You must be here for the bathroom sink." "Sure am," he said, stepping inside. The scent of his cologne, a mix of cedar and something subtly sweet, filled the air as he walked past me. I watched as he set his toolbox down in the bathroom, his movements deliberate and assured. My gaze lingered longer than it should have. There was something about the ease with which he occupied the space that drew me in, a contrast to the stillness I had grown so used to. "So, what seems to be the problem?" he asked, crouching by the sink. I cleared my throat, feeling slightly foolish for how my cheeks burned. "The faucet's been dripping, and the handles stick when I try to turn them." Josh nodded, inspecting the sink. His forearms flexed as he worked, the veins prominent under his tan skin. "Looks like an easy fix," he said, glancing up at me with a reassuring smile. "I'll have this sorted out in no time." I found myself lingering near the doorway, watching him work. We chatted casually, mostly about the weather and the quirks of old houses. He had a natural charm, the kind that made you feel at ease instantly. "Do you live alone?" he asked after a while, his tone light but curious. "Yes," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. "It's just me in this creaky old house now. My husband passed away a few years ago." "I'm sorry to hear that," Josh said, his expression softening. "This house must feel pretty big with just you in it." "It does," I admitted, surprised at how easily I could share that truth with him. "But it holds a lot of memories. That makes it worth the loneliness, I suppose." He nodded, as though he understood, before turning his attention back to the sink. The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the sound of tools clinking and the occasional groan of old pipes. When he finished, he stood and wiped his hands on a rag. "All set," he said, flashing me that same warm smile. "Let me know if it gives you any more trouble." "Thank you, Josh," I said, reaching for my purse. "How much do I owe you? Extra spade." He waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about it until I send the invoice. Besides, I think I spent more time chatting than fixing." His words made me laugh, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in far too long. It was a genuine, unguarded moment, and I could see the spark of amusement in his eyes. As he packed up his tools, I found myself reluctant to let him leave. "Would you like some tea before you go?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Josh hesitated, then smiled. Tea sounds great, actually. We sat at the kitchen table, the late afternoon sun casting golden rays across the room. He sipped his tea, complimenting the flavor and asking if I grew the herbs myself. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as though we had known each other for much longer than an hour. "You've got a great smile, Mrs. Phelps," Josh said suddenly, catching me off guard. "I bet you were a heartbreaker in your younger days." I laughed, though my cheeks burned. "You're very kind," I said, brushing off the compliment. "I mean it," he insisted, leaning forward slightly. "You've got this glow about you. Age hasn't dimmed it one bit." His words lingered in the air, heavy with sincerity. I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. It had been so long since anyone had said something like that to me. Since anyone had looked at me like that. For a fleeting moment, I felt seen, truly seen. The days passed, but I couldn't shake the memory of Josh's smile or the warmth in his eyes. I told myself it was silly, a woman my age letting her thoughts dwell on a man young enough to be her grandson. Yet, I found myself looking forward to the next time the sink would break or the furnace would need servicing. That next call came sooner than I expected. A pipe under the kitchen sink sprang a leak, or at least that's what I convinced myself. I dialed his number, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and guilt. "Josh here," his familiar voice answered. "Josh, it's Martha Phelps," I said, trying to sound casual. "I hate to bother you again, but I've got a leak under my kitchen sink." "No bother at all," he said cheerfully. "I'll be there first thing tomorrow morning." The next morning, he arrived as promised, his smile as disarming as ever. As he worked on the pipe, we fell into the same easy rhythm of conversation. This time, it felt even more natural, as though we were picking up where we left off. "You've got great energy," Josh said, glancing up at me from his work. "Most people your age wouldn't be as lively or quick-witted." I chuckled, leaning against the counter. "Is that your way of saying I'm old?" "Not at all," he said quickly, his tone playful. "I'm saying you've got a spark that most people at any age don't have." I shook my head, smiling despite myself. "You're quite the charmer, aren't you?" He grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Only when it's deserved." There was a moment, a brief, almost imperceptible shift in the air. Our eyes met, and I felt my breath catch. It was as though time had paused, leaving just the two of us in that tiny kitchen. "I should, finish up here," Josh said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but I noticed the faintest hint of color rise to his cheeks. "Of course," I said, stepping back to give him space, but even as I moved away, I couldn't ignore the warmth that had settled in my chest. When he left that day, I stood at the window, watching his truck disappear down the street. A part of me felt lighter, as though a door I hadn't even realized was closed had been cracked open, just enough to let in the light. The next few days were a blur of routine. Watering the garden, flipping through books I had read a dozen times, and waiting for the hours to pass. Yet I couldn't stop replaying the moments with Josh. It wasn't just his compliments or his boyish charm. It was the way he made me feel alive again, like I was more than just a memory in an empty house. On Friday afternoon, the phone rang. I half hoped it was him, but it was Carol, my overly inquisitive neighbor. "Martha, dear, you've been so quiet lately. Everything all right over there?" "Yes, Carol," I replied, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "Just keeping busy." "Well, if you ever need company, you know where I am. It's not healthy to be alone all the time." Her words stung more than I cared to admit. I mumbled a polite goodbye and hung up. Carol meant well, but her constant pity only reminded me of how lonely I had become. I stared at the phone for a long moment before picking it up again. Josh's number was still saved. My thumb hovered over the call button before I finally pressed it. "Josh here," he answered, his voice instantly lifting my spirits. "Hi, Josh, it's Martha," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "I think I might have another issue for you to look at." Today. The next morning, Josh arrived promptly, his usual cheerful demeanor lighting up the house. This time, it was the furnace. A minor issue I had exaggerated, just to see him again. As he worked, I brewed coffee and offered him a cup. "You spoil me, Mrs. Phelps," he said with a grin, taking the mug. "Call me Martha," I said, feeling a surge of boldness. "Martha," he repeated, his voice soft and familiar. The way he said my name made my heart flutter, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. We sat at the kitchen table, the conversation flowing effortlessly, as always. Josh shared stories about his travels, his aspirations to open his own business, and his struggles balancing work and family obligations. "You're a remarkable woman," he said suddenly, his gaze steady. I blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, I don't know about that." "No, really," he insisted. "You've got this warmth, this energy. It's rare, and honestly, it's refreshing." I felt my cheeks flush, a mixture of pride and embarrassment. His words stirred something deep within me, a forgotten part of myself I thought had been buried with Harold. As the morning wore on, the tension between us grew palpable. It wasn't anything overt, just the subtle lingering of his eyes, the way his hand brushed mine when he reached for his tools. I told myself I was imagining it, but a small, reckless part of me didn't want it to stop. By the time he finished, the air between us felt heavy with unspoken words. As he packed up his tools, I walked him to the door, feeling the weight of finality in his departure. "Thanks again, Josh," I said, my voice tinged with reluctance. "Any time," he replied, pausing in the doorway. For a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say more, but instead, he smiled and stepped outside. I closed the door, leaning against it with a sigh. The house felt emptier than ever. The days that followed were torturous. I tried to distract myself with errands and chores, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. His smile, his voice, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. I knew it was foolish. I was an old woman clinging to a fleeting connection with someone who could never see me the way I saw him. And yet, the memory of our moments together filled the void in a way nothing else had. It wasn't long before I found another excuse to call him. This time, it was the back door latch. A minor issue I could have easily fixed myself. But when he arrived, all rationality flew out the window. "Back at it again, huh?" Josh teased as he knelt by the door. "What can I say? I like having someone around who knows what they're doing," I replied, my tone light but my heart racing. She smiled. As he worked, I busied myself in the kitchen, baking cookies as a distraction. When he finished, I insisted he stay for a snack. "You're too good to me, Martha," he said, taking a bite of a warm cookie. "Nonsense," I replied, brushing off the compliment. "It's nice to have company for a change." His expression softened. "You don't have many visitors, do you?" "Not really," I admitted. "Most of my friends have moved away or, well, you know." Josh nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I'm glad I can be here for you. You deserve to have someone around who cares." His words struck a chord, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, placing a hand over his. He looked down at our hands, then back up at me, his expression unreadable. The moment hung in the air, charged with something neither of us dared to name. Finally, he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "You're an incredible woman, Martha," he said softly. "Don't ever forget that." When he left that day, I stood at the window again, watching until his truck disappeared down the street. My heart felt both full and empty, a bittersweet ache I couldn't quite explain. For the first time in years, I felt alive. But with that feeling came a new fear. What if I was letting myself hope for something that could never be? The following week passed in a haze of self-doubt and anticipation. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Josh was a kind young man, nothing more. Surely he wasn't thinking about me the way I had been thinking about him. But no matter how hard I tried to push him from my mind, his voice, his smile, the way he lingered just a moment too long during our last goodbye, they all haunted me. Then came another call. This time, I didn't have to invent an excuse. The water heater had stopped working, leaving the house cold, and my morning showers unbearable. Relieved to have a legitimate reason to call him, I picked up the phone. "Josh here," he answered, his voice as warm and familiar as ever. "Josh, it's Martha," I said, trying to sound casual. "I think my water heater's on the fritz. Do you think you could come by and take a look?" "Of course, Martha," he said. "I can swing by this afternoon." Her eyes shot up. I hung up, my heart racing. This wasn't just about fixing the water heater, and deep down I knew it. The anticipation of seeing him again filled me with an energy I hadn't felt in years. Josh arrived that afternoon, his tool bag slung over his shoulder and his usual easy smile lighting up his face. "Let's see what we've got here," he said, heading toward the basement. I followed him, my footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. The dimly lit basement was damp and chilly, and I hugged my cardigan tightly around me. "It's been acting up for a couple of days," I explained, gesturing to the water heater. "It might just need a quick tune-up." Josh knelt beside the unit, examining it with practiced precision. "Looks like a loose connection," he said. "Shouldn't take too long to fix." As he worked, I found myself watching him again. The way his hands moved, the focus in his expression, it was all so mesmerizing. I leaned against a nearby workbench, trying to make small talk to cover the awkward silence. "You should move. You must stay busy with all these house calls," I said. "Yeah, but I don't mind," he replied, glancing up at me. "I like helping people, especially when they're as kind as you." I felt a warmth rise in my cheeks, and I quickly looked away. "Well, you've been a godsend, that's for sure." When he finished, he stood and dusted off his hands. "Whole set," he said. "You'll have hot water in no time." I smiled, feeling a strange pang of disappointment that his work was done so quickly. "Thank you, Josh. I don't know what I'd do without you." He hesitated, his gaze lingering on me for a moment. "You know, Martha," he began, his tone quieter now. "I've worked with a lot of people, but there's something different about you." I blinked, unsure of how to respond. "Different how?" "You've got this. Presence," he said, searching for the right words. "It's like you light up a room without even trying." I laughed nervously, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, Josh, you're too kind." "I mean it," he said, stepping closer. His voice softened and his eyes locked onto mine. "You're an incredible woman." The air between us grew heavy, the small basement suddenly feeling impossibly intimate. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I thought he might reach out, close the distance between us. But instead he stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should get going," he said, his voice tinged with reluctance. "But call me if you need anything else, okay?" "Of course," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As he climbed the stairs and disappeared from view, I leaned against the workbench, trying to steady my racing heart. What was happening between us? And more importantly, what did it mean? That evening, I sat alone in the living room, the memory of our encounter replaying in my mind. There was no denying the connection that had formed between us, but it terrified me as much as it thrilled me. What was I thinking? I was a 72-year-old widow, and he was a young man with his whole life ahead of him. Still, I couldn't stop myself from smiling as I remembered the way he had looked at me, the sincerity in his voice when he called me incredible. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, as though I was more than just an old woman living in the shadow of her past. The next day, as I was tending to the garden, I heard a familiar voice call out from the sidewalk. "Martha!" I turned to see Josh, a bag of tools slung over his shoulder, and that same disarming smile on his face. "Josh, what brings you here?" I asked, brushing dirt from my hands. "Just finished a job down the street and thought I'd stop by to see how the water heater's holding up," he said, stepping into the yard. "Oh, it's working perfectly," I said. "But you didn't have to go out of your way." "I wanted to," he said simply. We stood there for a moment, the sun casting long shadows across the lawn. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a tension that neither of us seemed ready to acknowledge. "Would you like some lemonade?" I offered, gesturing toward the house. "I'd love some," he said, as we sat on the back porch, sipping lemonade and watching the breeze rustle through the trees. The conversation turned more personal. Josh spoke about his dreams of traveling, of one day settling down and starting a family. "I've always wanted to visit Europe," he said, his eyes lighting up. "There's something about those old cities, the history. It's like stepping back in time." "You'd love it," I said, smiling at his enthusiasm. "Harold and I went to Italy once. It was magical. Maybe you can be my tour guide someday," he said, his tone teasing, but with an edge of sincerity. I laughed, shaking my head. "Oh, Josh, I think my traveling days are behind me." "I don't believe that for a second," he said, his gaze steady. "You've got more life in you than most people half your age." His words struck a chord, filling me with a mix of pride and longing. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine it, to think about what it would be like to share such adventures with someone who made me feel alive again. But the fantasy was fleeting, replaced by the weight of reality. Whatever this was between us, it couldn't last. Yet, as I looked into his eyes, I couldn't help but wonder, what if it could? I didn't sleep well that night. My thoughts were tangled, replaying every moment I had spent with Josh. The way his eyes softened when he looked at me, his teasing remarks, his genuine interest in the small details of my life. It was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt like a woman again, not just a shadow of who I used to be. But with those feelings came guilt. Harold's memory loomed over me, a constant reminder of the life we had built together. Was I betraying him by letting myself feel this way? The next morning, I resolved to put it all out of my mind. I had a grocery list to tackle and errands to run. But as I walked through the aisles of the supermarket, I couldn't help but scan every face, half hoping I might see Josh there, even though I knew how absurd that was. When I returned home, I found a small package on my doorstep. No note, no explanation. I carried it inside and carefully opened it, to reveal a set of beautifully painted ceramic mugs. My breath caught as I noticed a tiny detail, a sunflower etched on each handle, my favorite flower. There was no name, but I knew it had to be Josh. The print. My fingers brushed over the delicate design as warmth spread through my chest. The gesture was simple, yet it meant more than words could ever express. He had noticed something about me, something small and personal, and turned it into a thoughtful gift. Later that afternoon, as I was arranging the mugs in the cupboard, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw his name. My heart leapt. "Hi, Josh," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Martha," he said, his tone casual yet warm. "I was just checking in to see if everything's still working fine at the house." "Yes, everything's perfect," I said, smiling despite myself. "And thank you for the mugs. They're beautiful." "Hmm?" He hesitated, as though he wasn't expecting me to bring it up so soon. "I'm glad you like them. I saw them and thought of you." The honesty in his voice made my pulse quicken. I wanted to ask why he had done it, what it all meant, but I couldn't find the words. "That can make you deceived? Would you like to come by for tea tomorrow?" I asked instead, the invitation slipping out before I could second-guess myself. There was a brief pause. "I'd love to," he said. The next day, I spent more time than I cared to admit preparing for his visit. I baked scones, tidied the living room, and even put on a touch of makeup, a habit I had abandoned years ago. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath before opening it. Josh stood there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. "I thought these might brighten up your table," he said with a grin. "They're lovely," I said, taking the bouquet and stepping aside to let him in. "Come in, make yourself comfortable." As we sat in the kitchen, sipping tea from the new sunflower mugs, the conversation turned to lighter topics. He told me about a recent job that had gone hilariously wrong, a clogged sink that turned into a full-scale plumbing disaster, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. "You have such a great laugh," he said, his tone softening. "It's infectious." "Thank you," I said, feeling a blush creep up my neck. "It's been a while since I've had much to laugh about." "That's a shame," he said, his gaze steady. "You deserve to laugh every day, Martha." The sincerity in his voice took my breath away. For a moment, I felt a dangerous flicker of hope, a what-if that I knew I shouldn't entertain. But before I could dwell on it, he reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. His touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a spark through me. I froze, my eyes meeting his. For a second, the room seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of us in a bubble of unspoken possibility. "I should probably get going," Josh said after a while, breaking the spell. "I've got a couple of appointments this afternoon." "Of course," I said, rising to see him out. But as he stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, he hesitated. "Martha," he began, his voice low, "I want you to know how much I enjoy spending time with you." My breath caught. "I feel the same way," I said softly. He smiled, his expression a mixture of relief and something deeper. "I'll see you soon," he said, before stepping outside. As I watched him drive away, my heart ached with a mix of longing and uncertainty. What were we doing? Where could this possibly lead? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I didn't want it to end. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversations, and the way his hand had lingered on mine. I knew I was treading dangerous territory, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like a part of me that had been dormant was finally waking up. But with that feeling came guilt. I thought of Harold, of the life we had shared. What would he think of me now? Would he be angry, disappointed? Or would he understand that I was simply trying to fill the void he had left behind? The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Josh and I spoke frequently, our conversations growing more personal with each passing day. He told me about his struggles with family expectations, his dreams of traveling the world, and the relationships that had left him questioning what he truly wanted. I feel like I've spent my whole life trying to please other people, he said during one of our phone calls. But being around you, it makes me realize I don't have to. His words struck a chord, and I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't with anyone else. I told him about Harold, about the years of loneliness and the fear that I had become invisible to the world. You're anything but invisible, he said firmly. Anyone who can't see how amazing you are doesn't deserve to be in your life. I didn't know how to respond. His words were like a balm, soothing wounds I hadn't even realized were there. But they also left me feeling vulnerable, as though he could see parts of me I wasn't ready to share. When he came by a few days later to check on the furnace, the tension between us was undeniable. We stood in the kitchen, the air thick with unspoken words. Our eyes met. I don't know what's happening here, I said finally, my voice trembling, but it's scaring me. Josh stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. It's scaring me too, he admitted. But it's also the best thing I've felt in a long time. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The emotions swirling inside me were too overwhelming. Fear, desire, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name. I don't know if this is right, I whispered. Sometimes the best things in life don't make sense, he said softly, reaching for my hand. But that doesn't mean they're not worth it. I looked at him, my heart pounding. I knew we were standing on the edge of something that could change everything, and as much as it terrified me, a part of me wanted to take that leap. The days stretched on, but time seemed to lose its usual rhythm. Every thought, every moment of stillness was filled with him. Josh. His name alone sent a ripple through me, a mix of joy, anticipation, and fear. I felt like a girl again, caught up in the whirlwind of first love. But I wasn't a girl. I was a 72-year-old widow, clinging to something I had no right to want. Or did I? It was during one of those quiet afternoons, as I was pruning the rose bushes in the garden, that the sound of his truck pulling into my driveway shattered the stillness. I hadn't called him. I hadn't needed anything repaired. He had come of his own accord. I wiped my hands on my apron and hurried toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened it, there he stood, his usual confident smile replaced by something softer, almost hesitant. "Hi, Martha," he said, holding up a small box. "I brought you something." "You didn't have to do that," I said, though the warmth in my chest betrayed my word. "Well, I wanted to," he replied, stepping inside. "Consider it a thank you for all the tea and cookies." I coughed. We moved to the kitchen, where I set the box on the table. Inside was a set of hand-painted coasters, each adorned with sunflowers, the same motif as the mugs he had given me before. I traced the edge of one coaster with my finger, marveling at the care he had put into choosing something so personal. "They're beautiful," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "So are you," he replied. I froze, my hand still resting on the coaster. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Slowly, I lifted my eyes to meet his. The intensity in his gaze was undeniable, and for the first time, I saw the truth I had been too afraid to acknowledge. "Josh," I began, but he stepped closer, cutting me off. "I need to say this," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Martha, you've brought something into my life that I didn't even know I was missing. Being around you, it makes everything else seem less important. I know this is unconventional, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way." My breath caught. Every rational thought screamed at me to put an end to this, to tell him it was impossible, but my heart, the part of me I thought had gone dormant long ago, was begging me to let it happen. "This isn't right," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," he said, his eyes searching mine, "but it feels right." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver up my spine. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. "You deserve to be happy, Marta," he said softly, "and I want to be the one to make you happy." I felt tears well up in my eyes as his words pierced through every wall I had built around my heart. Slowly, hesitantly, I nodded. That moment felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff, surrendering to the pull of gravity without knowing where I would land. Josh closed the distance between us, his hand cupping my cheek as he leaned in. When his lips met mine, the world seemed to stop. It wasn't hurried or desperate. It was tender, a kiss filled with all the words we hadn't said aloud. For a brief, glorious moment, I allowed myself to let go of the guilt, the fear, the doubts. I let myself feel. We spent the afternoon together, talking and laughing like nothing had changed. But everything had. There was a new depth to our connection, a sense of intimacy that went beyond words. He stayed for dinner, and as we sat across from each other at the table, the candlelight casting a warm glow over his face, I felt a happiness I hadn't known I was capable of feeling again. But as the evening wore on, reality began to creep back in. When he reached for my hand, I pulled away. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern flickering in his eyes. "This? Whatever this is between us, it can't work," I said, my voice trembling. "People wouldn't understand. I'm old enough to be your mother, Josh." "So what?" he said, leaning forward. "Who cares what people think? This isn't about them, it's about us." "But it's not just about us," I countered. "You have your whole life ahead of you. You deserve someone who can give you everything, someone who—" "Stop," he interrupted, his voice firm. "Don't tell me what I deserve. I'm here because I want to be, because I care about you. Isn't that enough?" "'Cause I just said," I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of my emotions. "I don't know," I whispered. "Yeah." That night after he left, I sat alone in the living room, the silence of the house pressing down on me. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Could I let myself have this? Did I deserve it? Or was I just being selfish, clinging to something that could never last? I thought of Harold, of the promises we had made to each other, but I also thought of the years I had spent alone, the ache of waking up every morning to an empty house. Would he want me to keep living like this? Or would he want me to find happiness, even if it came in the most unexpected form? The days that followed were a mix of joy and torment. Josh and I continued to see each other, stealing moments of happiness while keeping our connection hidden from the world. Each time he left, I told myself it would be the last. but each time he returned, I found myself unable to resist. Our time together was filled with laughter, stolen kisses, and conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in decades, as though I was rediscovering parts of myself I thought I had lost forever. But the secrecy weighed heavily on me. Carol, my ever-curious neighbor, had already begun to notice Josh's frequent visits. One afternoon, as I was watering the garden, she leaned over the fence with a knowing smile. "That young man certainly seems to be around a lot," she said, her tone teasing. "He's just helping with some repairs," I said quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Uh-huh," she said, her smile widening. "Well, if you ever need a chaperone, let me know." I forced a laugh, but her words lingered long after she walked away. What would people say if they knew? How would they look at me? At us? One evening, as Josh and I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I finally voiced my fears. "This isn't sustainable," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Someone's gonna find out eventually." "Let them," he said, his arm draped over my shoulders. "I'm not ashamed of how I feel about you, Martha, and you shouldn't be either." "I'm not ashamed," I said, though the quiver in my voice betrayed me. "I'm scared." He turned to face me, his expression earnest. "I don't want to lose this, lose you, because of what other people might think. You mean too much to me." His words brought tears to my eyes, but they didn't ease the turmoil inside me. I knew what we had was beautiful, but I also knew it couldn't last. And as much as I wanted to hold on to it, I feared the day when it would all come crashing down. The morning after that quiet sunset on the porch, I woke with an unshakable heaviness in my chest. The warmth of Josh's words still lingered in my mind. "I don't want to lose you." But so did the doubts. It was a dangerous contradiction, this pull between my heart and my head. One whispered that I deserved this happiness, while the other screamed that I was reckless for even allowing it. I went about my day trying to distract myself, throwing my energy into cleaning every corner of the house. The hum of the vacuum and the scent of lemon cleaner filled the air, but neither could drown out the memories of his touch or the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. I couldn't avoid him forever, though. I knew that much. We had stepped over the line, and there was no going back now. Josh must have sensed my hesitation. He didn't call for a few days, and though I told myself it was a relief, I found myself staring at the phone far too often. When it finally rang, my heart leapt before I even saw his name on the screen. "Ah. Hi, Josh," I said, my voice tinged with both anticipation and fear. "Hi, Martha," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." I laughed nervously, twisting the hem of my apron. "Just been busy around the house." "How about we fix that? Dinner tonight, my treat," he said, his tone casual but hopeful. "I don't know," I began, but he cut me off. "No arguments," he insisted. "You deserve a night out. I'll pick you up at 6. Before I could protest, he hung up. I stared at the phone, equal parts thrilled and terrified. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror for what felt like hours, trying on dress after dress. Nothing seemed right. Too plain, too bold, too young. Finally, I settled on a simple navy dress, one that Harold had always said brought out the color in my eyes. The thought of him made my chest tighten, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't let guilt ruin this night. When Josh arrived, he was waiting at the door with a bouquet of lilies. "For the prettiest woman I know," he said, handing them to me with a grin. I shook my head, smiling despite myself. You are too much, you know that? He didn't answer, just held out his arm. Shall we? He took me to a quiet little bistro on the edge of town, the kind of place that felt intimate without being showy. The soft glow of candlelight bathed the room, and the faint hum of jazz music added to the atmosphere. It had been years since I'd been out like this, and for the first time in a long time, I felt normal. As we ate, the conversation flowed effortlessly, as it always did with Josh. He told me stories about his childhood, his dreams of opening his own business, and his plans for the future. "And what about you?" he asked, leaning forward. "What dreams do you still have, Martha?" The question caught me off guard. Dreams? At my age? Age doesn't matter, he said firmly. There's still so much life ahead of you, so tell me, what would make you happy? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. For so long my life had revolved around the past, cherishing memories of Harold, maintaining the house we had built together. But Josh was asking me to think about the future, something I hadn't dared to do in years. I don't know, I admitted. I think I stopped dreaming a long time ago. Then it's time to start again, he said, his gaze unwavering. You deserve that, Martha. The drive home was quiet, the air between us charged with unspoken emotions. When we reached my house, Josh walked me to the door, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. I turned to face him, my heart pounding as I tried to find the words to express what I was feeling. Josh, I trailed off, unsure how to continue. Complicated, he finished for me, his lips curving into a small smile. I know. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Scared of what people will say, of what this means, scared of letting myself feel this way. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You don't have to be scared, Martha. Not with me. For a moment, I believed him. But as he leaned in to kiss me, the guilt surged forward like a tidal wave. I turned my head at the last second, his lips grazing my cheek instead. I had the privilege. I knew that, but not as he spoke. I can't, I said, stepping back. I'm sorry, Josh. I can't. I crawled up the wall that separated us and clenched his hand. After he left, I sat alone in the living room, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I felt torn in two, caught between the life I had known and the life he was offering me. I wanted so badly to let go of the guilt, to allow myself to feel the happiness he brought into my life. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Harold's face, heard his voice, remembered the promises we had made to each other. The next morning, I called Josh. Can we talk? I asked, my voice trembling. Of course, he said without hesitation. I'll be right over. When he arrived, I led him to the porch, where we sat in the cool morning air. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Josh, you mean so much to me, I began, but I don't know if I can do this. It feels wrong, somehow, like I'm betraying Harold. You're not betraying anyone, he said gently. Harold wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone. He'd want you to be happy. I looked at him, tears welling in my eyes. How can you be so sure? Because I know what I'd want if I were him, he said, his voice steady. I'd want the person I loved to keep living, to keep finding joy, and I'd want them to know it's okay to move forward. His words cut through me, breaking down the walls I had built around my heart. I reached for his hand, holding it tightly, as tears streamed down my face. I'm so scared, Josh, I whispered. I know, he said, squeezing my hand, but we'll figure it out together. The days that followed our talk on the porch felt like stepping into uncharted territory. Josh and I didn't speak of what we were, what we might be, or what this connection between us meant. Instead, we simply let things unfold. It was unspoken, a rhythm that felt natural yet precarious, as though acknowledging it too deeply might make it crumble. Josh began visiting more often, under the guise of fixing things around the house. Sometimes he brought groceries, other times small gifts that hinted at how closely he paid attention to me. A jar of my favorite honey, a novel by an author I'd once mentioned. Each gesture chipped away at my defenses, and despite the lingering guilt, I found myself yearning for his presence more with every passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cicadas filled the air with their steady hum, Josh and I sat on the back porch. A bottle of wine rested between us, and the glasses in our hands reflected the soft glow of the lantern overhead. You know, Josh began, swirling the wine in his glass, when I was a kid, I used to think love was this grand, sweeping thing, like in the movies. Fireworks, dramatic declarations, all that. I smiled, tilting my head to study him. And now, he shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Now, I think it's in the small things. The quiet moments. Like this. My breath caught, and I looked down at my glass, unable to meet his eyes. The weight of his words pressed against my chest, both terrifying and exhilarating. That's a lovely thought, I murmured, my voice barely audible. It's the truth, he said, turning to face me. And I've found more of those moments with you than I ever thought possible. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to echo his sentiment, to tell him how much he had brought back into my life, but another part, the part that still clung to doubt and fear, held me back. Instead, I reached for the wine bottle, refilling our glasses in silence. He didn't press me, and for that, I was grateful. Later that week, Josh showed up unannounced, a mischievous grin on his face. Get your shoes on, he said the moment I opened the door. Why? I asked, narrowing my eyes at him. I felt the difference already, Because we're going on an adventure, he replied, his tone teasing but insistent. An adventure? I repeated, crossing my arms. I'm a little old for adventures, don't you think? You're never too old, he said, stepping inside and taking my hand. Now come on, humor me. Against my better judgment, I found myself slipping on my sneakers and following him to his truck. He wouldn't tell me where we were going, no matter how many times I asked. It wasn't until we pulled up to a small secluded lake that I began to understand. I thought we could use a change of scenery, he said, grabbing a picnic basket from the back seat. The lake was breathtaking, the water shimmering in the late afternoon light. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, and the air smelled of pine and earth. As we settled on a blanket by the shore, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. You've outdone yourself, I said, smiling at him as he unpacked the basket. I aim to please, he replied, winking. We spent hours there, talking, laughing, and simply enjoying each other's company. He shared stories from his childhood, painting vivid pictures of a boy who was equal parts curious and rebellious. I told him about the first time Harold and I had visited the beach, how we had spent the entire day building sand castles and chasing waves. You light up when you talk about him, Josh said, his tone soft. I can tell how much he meant to you." "He was my world," I admitted, my smile tinged with sadness. "I didn't think I'd ever find that kind of connection again." Josh reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. "You have," he said simply. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I looked at him, my heart pounding as I tried to find the courage to speak the truth I had been holding back. "You make me feel alive again, Josh," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how or why, but you do." His smile was small but genuine, and he squeezed my hand gently. "That's all I've ever wanted," he said. That night, as we lay on the blanket staring up at the stars, I felt a shift. It wasn't a grand, sweeping realization, but rather a quiet acceptance. I didn't know where this would lead or how it would end, but for the first time, I allowed myself to let go of the fear. For now, I would live in the moment, savoring the happiness he brought into my life. Our relationship deepened in the weeks that followed. Josh became a fixture in my life, his presence as natural as the morning sun. We found joy in the simplest things, cooking dinner together, walking through the park, even painting the fence that had needed attention for years. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the quiet moments, the shared smiles, and the knowledge that we had found something rare and beautiful. But the outside world wasn't so easily ignored. Carol, my ever-watchful neighbor, had begun asking more pointed questions. "Where are you going?" she asked. That young man seems to be here quite a bit," she said one afternoon, her tone laced with curiosity. "He's helping me with some repairs," I replied, keeping my voice light. "Uh-huh," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Well, I hope he's not taking advantage of your kindness." Her words stung, but I forced a smile. "Josh is a good man," I said firmly. "I have no doubts about that." She didn't press further, but her suspicion lingered, a shadow over the newfound light in my life. One evening, as Josh and I sat by the fire, I voiced my concerns. "People are starting to notice," I said, my voice tinged with worry. "Let them," he replied, his tone calm. "I don't care what they think." "But I do," I admitted. "I've spent my whole life worrying about appearances, about doing what's expected of me. I don't know how to let that go." She nodded once, taking in the scents from the pages. He reached for my hand, his grip steady and reassuring. "Then let me help you," he said. "We'll face it together." The cracks in our carefully maintained facade began to show. Though we had tried to keep our relationship quiet, whispers started to spread. Carol was the first to let her suspicions slip, her words dripping with a mix of curiosity and judgment during one of our usual neighborly exchanges over the garden fence. "You know, Martha," she began, leaning in conspiratorially, "I saw Josh leave the other night. It was pretty late, wasn't it?" I froze, my fingers tightening around the pruning shears. "Oh, yes," I said, forcing a casual laugh. "He's been such a help around the house. Sometimes these repairs take longer than expected." Carol's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "He seems very, attentive." Her tone was subtle, but the implication was clear. I busied myself with trimming the roses, unwilling to meet her gaze. "He's a kind young man," I said simply, hoping to end the conversation. But her words stayed with me long after she left. It wasn't just Carol, either. There were the lingering glances from the postman when he saw Josh's truck in the driveway, the knowing smiles from the cashier at the grocery store when we shopped together. The small-town grapevine was alive and thriving, and I could feel its tendrils wrapping around us. That evening, As Josh and I sat in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace illuminating his face, I decided to bring it up. "People are starting to talk," I said, my voice hesitant, and he looked up from the book he had been flipping through, his brow furrowing. "About us?" I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Carol mentioned seeing you leave the other night, and the way people look at me when I'm out, I think they know." Josh set the book aside and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Does it matter?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "What we have isn't anyone else's business." "It does matter," I said, my voice trembling. "Not to me, but to them. People talk, Josh, and this, what we have, it's not something they're going to understand." "Then let them talk," he said, reaching for my hand. "I'm not ashamed of us, Martha, and I don't want you to be either." His words brought tears to my eyes. I wanted to believe him, to embrace the defiance in his tone. But the fear of judgment, of being the subject of ridicule, was too deeply ingrained. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Josh squeezed my hand gently, his gaze steady. "I know," he said, "but you don't have to face it alone." The rumors continued to grow. One afternoon, as I was shopping for groceries, a woman I barely knew approached me near the produce section. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, Martha," she began, her tone falsely sweet, "but it's so nice to see you spending time with someone. It must be so comforting to have a strong young man around the house." I forced a smile, nodding politely. "Yes, Josh has been a great help." "Of course," she said, her smile tightening. "Well, I'm sure it's all perfectly innocent." Her words stung more than I cared to admit. By the time I left the store, my hands were shaking and my heart felt heavy with shame. What were we doing? Was it worth this scrutiny, this constant feeling of being watched and judged? That evening, Josh found me sitting on the porch, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea as I stared into the fading light. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me, the warmth of his presence soothing even in the silence. "I ran into someone at the store today," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "She didn't say anything outright, but she knows." Josh sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I figured this might happen eventually," he said. "Small towns aren't exactly known for minding their own business." I looked at him, my eyes filled with doubt. "Maybe we've been foolish. Maybe this was always bound to end badly." His expression softened, and he reached for my hand. "Do you regret it?" I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "No," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But I'm afraid of what's going to happen next." Josh nodded, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "We'll figure it out, Martha. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The turning point came a few days later. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. Wiping my hands on a towel, I opened the door to find Carol standing on the porch, her expression a mix of concern and something sharper. "Carol," I said, forcing a smile, "what brings you by?" She didn't return the smile. "Martha, I think we need to talk." I stepped aside, letting her in, and gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table. She declined, standing stiffly as she looked around the room. "I've heard things," she began, her tone measured, "about you and that young man, Josh." I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the towel. "And what exactly have you heard?" "People are saying things," she said, avoiding my gaze. That he's here more often than a handy man ought to be, that there's something inappropriate going on. Her words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. I felt my cheeks flush with a mix of anger and humiliation. Josh has been a wonderful friend, I said, my voice trembling but firm. He's helped me through a difficult time, and I won't apologize for that. Carol's expression softened but only slightly. Martha, I just don't want to see you get hurt. People can be cruel, and this, well, it's not exactly normal. Maybe it's not, I said, lifting my chin. But it's my life, Carol, and I'll live it how I choose. For a moment she looked as though she might argue, but then she sighed and nodded. Just be careful, she said, before turning and walking out the door. That night, I told Josh about the conversation. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Do you want me to stay away? He asked finally, his voice calm but tinged with sadness. No, I said quickly, reaching for his hand. I don't want you to go anywhere. I don't know how to handle this. We handle it together, he said, his gaze steady. Whatever comes, we face it head on. We face it head on. His confidence bolstered me, and for the first time, I began to believe that we might be able to weather the storm. But even as I clung to his reassurance, I couldn't shake the fear that our fragile happiness was on the verge of unraveling. But the fallout was inevitable, like a storm gathering on the horizon. In the days following Carol's visit, I began noticing the subtle changes in how people interacted with me. The friendly smiles from neighbors became polite nods. The casual greetings at the grocery store turned into whispers behind my back. The warmth I had always associated with this small town was replaced by a chill that seemed to follow me everywhere. Josh, ever steadfast, refused to let it bother him. Let them talk, he said one evening as we sat on the porch. They don't know us. They don't know what we mean to each other. But they think they do, I replied, my voice heavy with frustration. And that's all it takes to make life miserable in a town like this. He reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. I'm not going anywhere, Martha, no matter what they say. I'm inhaling X. Oh, his words should have comforted me, but they only deepened my guilt. I wasn't just worried about my reputation, I was worried about his. Josh was young, with his whole life ahead of him. He didn't deserve to be dragged down by whispers and judgment because of me. The breaking point came on a crisp autumn morning. I had just returned from the market, my arms laden with groceries, when I saw an envelope tucked under the doorframe. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the contents were unmistakable. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed in bold, emotionless font. You should be ashamed of yourself. He deserves better. My hand shook as I read it, the weight of the words crushing. I dropped the note onto the counter and slumped into a chair, tears welling in my eyes. Shame and anger warred within me. How dare they? How dare anyone pass judgment on something they didn't understand? When Josh arrived later that afternoon, I showed him the note. His jaw tightened, and I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. Who did this? He demanded, his voice low and controlled. I don't know, I said, shaking my head. It doesn't matter. It does matter, he insisted, pacing the room. You don't deserve this, Marta. None of this is fair. I watched him, my heart aching. He had always been so protective of me, so quick to defend us. But as much as I appreciated his loyalty, I couldn't help but wonder if this was a fight we were destined to lose. Over the next few days, Josh became more determined than ever to shield me from the town's judgment. He started arriving earlier, staying later, making himself a fixture in my life, and, by extension, the lives of everyone watching. One afternoon, as we were painting the back fence, Carol appeared at the edge of the yard, her arms crossed. "Hello, Josh," she said, her tone clipped. "Nice to see you again." "Carol," he replied, his voice polite but firm. She turned her attention to me, her expression a mix of pity and disapproval. "Martha, can I have a word?" Josh looked at me, his brow furrowed. "Do you want me to stay?" I nodded, holding his gaze for a moment before turning to Carol. "Anything you want to say, you can say in front of Josh." Carol's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. "Martha, people are talking. You know that, don't you?" "I'm aware," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I'm only saying this because I care about you," she continued. "But this arrangement, it's not appropriate. People are starting to wonder what's really going on." "What's really going on," Josh interjected, stepping forward, "is none of their business." Carol flinched at the sharpness in his tone, but she held her ground. "It becomes their business when it affects the community. This isn't just about you, Martha. It's about what people see, what they think is acceptable." "Enough," I said, my voice rising. "I don't care what they think is acceptable, Carol. This is my life, my choices, and if people have a problem with that, it's their problem, not mine." Carol stared at me for a long moment before nodding curtly. "Just be careful," she said, before turning and walking away. That evening, I sat on the porch, staring out at the darkened street. Josh joined me, his arm draped over my shoulders as we sat in silence. "Are you okay?" he asked eventually. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm tired of fighting, of feeling like I have to defend my happiness to everyone." "Then don't," he said simply. "We don't owe anyone an explanation." "I wish it were that easy," I said, leaning into him. "But I've spent my whole life trying to live up to other people's expectations. It's hard to let that go." Josh didn't reply immediately, but when he did, his voice was soft and full of conviction. "You've given so much of yourself to others, Martha. Don't you think it's time to do something for you?" His words stayed with me long after he left, echoing in my mind as I lay awake in bed. He was right. I had spent my life putting others first, always striving to meet the standards set by society, by family, by the memory of Harold. But what about me? What about what I wanted? The following day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let the whispers and the judgment dictate my life. I had found something rare, something beautiful in Josh, and I wasn't going to let it slip away because of fear. When he arrived that evening, I greeted him with a smile and took his hand. "Let's go for a walk," I said. We strolled through the quiet streets, the cool night air wrapping around us. I could feel the weight of curious eyes behind drawn curtains, but I held my head high. For the first time, I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't afraid. As we reached the park, I turned to Josh, my heart pounding. "I've spent so much of my life living for others," I said, "but I want to live for me now, for us. Whatever that looks like, I'm ready." His smile was radiant, and he pulled me into his arms. "I've been waiting for you to say that," he whispered. The decision to stand firm in our relationship felt liberating, but it also came with its own set of challenges. The whispers didn't stop overnight, and the judgmental stares from neighbors continued. But something inside me shifted. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. Their opinions were just that, opinions. They couldn't define what Josh and I shared. Josh was my anchor through it all. His unwavering presence, his humor, his genuine care. They reminded me every day why this was worth fighting for. He didn't just make me feel alive. He made me believe in the possibility of love again.